Good afternoon. Welcome to, recording in progress. Welcome to Friday Few to Clancast, our bi-weekly or once fortnightly Clancast. Today we're going to be discussing with our esteemed DataClan colleagues the question of data into decisions, and as you can see there, the psychology behind better, faster decisions, and we all want some of them. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is just set out as a bit of a format. So I'm going to, as promised on various social media platforms, we're going to explore this through the context of a decision funnel. And I'm going to talk you through a bit about what that involves, or at least my take on it, and how that relates to the work that DataClan does, and hopefully some of the challenges that you face in your organizations or ambitions that you have for business change and evolution. So following that, what we'll do is we're going to, I'll invite my DataClan colleagues here just to reflect on some of the things that are in the next couple of slides. And then from there, we can then have an open discussion. So please feel free to put into the chat or indicate if you want to contribute. So the decision funnel, it is a thing. Who knew? In a tried and tested, good old-fashioned Google search, it transpires that the decision funnel is there's a pretty big consultancy bull market for decision funnels. So this is a screen grab which shows us four things. One transpires my search history, so ignore that. The second thing that it shows is that there's a plethora of decision funnels that can be applied in almost any business or organization or sort of challenge. And I guess as well, the confirmation that a funnel is indeed, as its name suggests, something that takes things that potentially are quite fluid, or voluminous and mixed, and tries to channel that somewhere where you want it to be. So hopefully, as a metaphor, that will be a good perspective or lens to look through for today. So DataClan does go in for the decision funnel, and here I give you the DataClan decision funnel, slightly more rudimentary. I'm sure you'll agree than some of the colorful images, but at DataClan, what we like to go for is the kind of meaning behind it rather than what color or context to make it look nice. So we've gone DataClan green, but it is nonetheless a funnel. And at the top of that funnel, we have data decisions, the title, the psychology behind better and faster decisions. So what starts at the beginning of the funnel really, and it's not limited to this list, but your questions, your challenges, your ambitions, and of course, your frustrations that come with all sorts of business change and trying to achieve service excellence. So these are the things that are also at the top of the funnel. So your experience, most of the time, undoubted commitment to your business and to the services that you try to provide and shape, and to your strategy. Experience is in there twice. I'd like to say that was the typo, but in fact, it's just because I think experience is such an important factor that I've repeated it. And ambition. So I think that as well, it's where do we want to go next? What are your ambitions for the organization? How do we improve? How do we get better? How do we make the most opportunities? And how do we, at the end of the day, optimize our services towards that service excellence, whether it's internal customers, external customers, or just performance? These are the two, these are kind of two additional components, really. When you add together experience and the ambition and the commitment, and I think I think it's worth calling out that under those subheadings there are additional technical abilities, processes, and all of the things that we know are component parts of how we run our organizations. But the key things I wanted to call out here really are that there are pockets of success and innovation that emerge out of that combination of things as you move towards as you try to focus your effort. But at the same time, there are some perceived negative outcomes, which we will probably all recognize, where you get a kind of split culture. So there's a misalignment of what people's objectives within a given organization are, and also flatlining KPIs. So we've all experienced that, regardless of what you do to try to change your service, your performance is going either in the wrong direction or is not improving or is not you're not seeing the numbers that you want to understand. Now, we've explored in previous Climbcast sessions some of the underlying drivers behind both the success and innovation side of things, but also around where there are misalignment or performance limitations. So in the process of this decision funnel, from DataClan's perspective and through our sort of real world experience and a practical application, as you know, we try to apply a multi-specialist approach to looking at problem solving and looking at innovation. And it includes these 6 factors which I've set out towards the bottom of the funnel. So as to extend the metaphor, as we get closer to the focus, we're trying to kind of combine the things at the top that you can see there: the experience, commitment, ambition, pockets of innovation, success, some of the challenges that come with that, and the 6 aspects there that I've outlined are really what is distilled from those, and what we've found through our experience to be the key factors. And obviously at the bottom, if the objective is really to try to change your organization to operate in a better way. So what I wanted just to call out before I invite our colleagues just to reflect on some of these things was really just that some of the challenges that come through the decision funnel as it relates to making better decisions. Human psychology comes kind of preloaded with a number of glitches, if you like, where there are preconceptions or self-orientated perspectives of how you make decisions. And quite often, those naturally occurring psychological traits can create things like confirmation bias and so on, that in some ways distort, whether it's looking for data retrospectively to prove your point, or whether it's misinterpretation of data, or whether it's a misalignment of culture, or whether it's looking at the objectives of your organization from only from a single standpoint, or in a myopic way. Just to use a topical example, one of the studies that I'll have to refer to here on my phone refers to the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is to do with people persevering regardless. So despite the fact that there is a decision-making funnel or decision funnel, there is a degree that if you keep bashing away at things, that you will eventually get the answer that you're looking for. And when you combine those psychological glitches and things like confirmation bias with that bloody mindedness and perseverance, which is often or has historically been seen as being a positive attribute, sometimes actually what you're doing is compounding the problem that you face in the first instance. So I mentioned the topical example. We couldn't have a DataClan Climbcast session without mentioning COVID, which is obviously where we find out the origins of DataClan itself in its previous manifestation. And troublingly, the WHO has said that COVID has been accompanied by a massive infodemic. And I mentioned Dunning-Kruger because a key element of misinformation spreading, as we've discussed in previous sessions. And just referring to some of the data here, in April this year, a study of more than 2,000 participants tested in the relationship between the knowledge of COVID and the confidence in that knowledge. And the results showed that a superior sense of confidence correlated with lower levels of knowledge. Now, that's not just Dunning-Kruger. In the same article, which I'll share on the chat in a second, even Charles Darwin had, according to this article in 1871, says ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. So I think that was Darwin's way of saying that Dunning-Kruger is correct in their assumption that the bedfellows of incompetence or bad decision making often reside next to an inability to see that you're making that problem. So goes back full circle really to why this is about the psychology of it, because it's about understanding how your thought process works in order to not allow you to fall into these traps, confirmation bias and so on, and for you to combine the aspects and ambitions at the beginning of the filter to ensure that it translates in a practical sense, in a strategic sense, in a tactical sense into the change that you see at the bottom of the filter. Fun, he said. Filter, fun. Filter, there we go, we've invented a new metaphor. So if I just stop sharing my screen for a second. What I would like to do is, normally our CEO cracks the whip on these, but today we're turning the tables on him a little bit. So I had introduced this session, and we wanted just to take a slightly different perspective, and we're looking at it from a psychological point of view. Now, no psychological review by anybody in DataClan would be complete without some input from Dr. Claire Murray, our resident psychologist. So what I wanted to do in turning the tables was just to invite my DataClan colleagues, starting with Claire, so you get a 10-second warning, out of the blue, to pluck from her vast experience, knowledge of real-world application, in the sense of those 6 elements around prioritization, alignment, sequencing, and so on. I'd like to just to do a couple of things. One, to reflect on the model just more generally, but if you would like to do it from this perspective, from your psychological kind of training perspective, but if you could feel free to pick on one of those attributes as they relate to business change as you understand it. Claire.
Lovely, thanks, Rob. Really interesting, and I love the model. I think it really it reflects the challenges that organisations are facing at the moment, particularly around change. So a couple of things that I wanted to pick up on. So first of all, the whole idea about the psychology behind decision making. I've done a lot of work with clients, with teams actually, where you know, it's really important, particularly when there's a new challenge or a new solution that needs finding, or a new frustration, that we have, or people are given some kind of structure or thinking structure, decision-making model, which you have clearly outlined here, which is really important, I think, because quite often when we have new problems, like you say, to avoid the risk of perhaps confirmation bias or misassumptions, unconscious bias, all those cognitive traps that we know people fall into, it's really important that those are kind of built into any decision-making model or framework. And I think also that the model really helps because, of course, we know now change is now part of a normal part of organisational life. We look at the global business environment, it's much more fast-paced, complex, uncertain. So again, having some kind of decision-making framework, I think, really helps people to kind of link and build different bits of data in order to create this powerful solution. And the other thing that I think it does is it helps people to slow down. So in our, you know, the work that we're doing, and I've done with clients with DataClan, is that there's often this pressure or a kind of tension between needing to make a decision quickly, but at the same time making sure that we've got all the information that we need. And sometimes it's important, working with teams, to say, actually, we need to work out which of these complex decisions you need to get different types of information, and take the time to link those different bits of information. And the linking and build process is really where we get to those powerful solutions. And of course, that also includes, which links into one element of the model that I want to talk about, alignment. Increasingly now, we know how important it is to have diversity in a team, to get different perspectives, to get different data from different sources, and be able to build those into a complex decision-making process. So that's, that's great, and that's why I think that this model is really important. And of course, alignment from a psychological perspective is absolutely critical. So how you use that data, so once you've come up with this great solution or decision, how are you going to get people aligned and engaged behind it, particularly when that involves change? So that the alignment, I think, starts at the outset, the very top part of that funnel, where you have to make sure you've got the right people around the table. The more involved people feel in a decision, particularly when it's around change, the more engagement you get from the outset. So alignment is critical. Who are the stakeholders? And not only that, different stakeholders might need to hear it in a slightly different way. So thinking about what do these different groups of stakeholders need to hear in order to be persuaded? And of course, then we're moving into alignment stroke influencing. And how you use the data and how you portray the data behind that decision may need to be adapted according to the different stakeholder groups, so it lands with each of them. So yeah, I would say that alignment is critical.
Okay, thank you, Claire, for that. I mean, I particularly like, the thinking structure. I think I think we should be patenting that as soon as possible. I think the point about cognitive traps and slowing down to speed up is something that, that quite often is a counterintuitive step to take. But I mean, from a decision-making process, from the funnel perspective, the idea, I suppose, is that by focusing on what those prioritization, or how do you prioritize your biggest pain points and so on, you're able to deal with what affects the biggest change in the shortest space of time, which, as you said, it's an illusion that by working faster, actually you're becoming more efficient. Mm-hmm. That brings me on to Dr. William Fawcett, who's going to share his insights. Now, as an architect, William, when you look at the decision funnel there, what adjectives at the bottom there, or spring out to you as being something that is relatable in your field on a day-to-day operational basis?
Well, I think the aspect of the funnel is that in a construction project like Has Been Made decision, you start off with lots of possibilities and you end up with one building. And somehow, I mean, imagine an architectural competition. I think Sydney Opera House had several hundred entries. So you had several hundred possibilities and you end up with one building. How do you end up with the right building at the end of it? Of course, you could ask that in Sydney Opera House, did they do it? I mean, it's a splendid building, but it was had huge problems. Anyway, but the same process of going from many possibilities to one decision is in a way, it's more encapsulated when you're briefing for a building, before you even start designing it, saying what is it we actually want. So a client will typically have a kind of bundle of problems, things that aren't working well, and some buildings they already have which could be adapted. They might want to build more buildings, but from this confusion about what the problems and the solutions, often clients are just completely overwhelmed. They're just confused, don't know what to do. And if they're wise, they bring in a good consultant to help them. And when we did this for one particular project, I recall was for a college library, but it wasn't just a library, it was the archives and the historic collections and modern collections. I think they had 4 different collections, and they're in 4 different places now. The whole thing was a shambles, and they knew it was a shambles, but they didn't know how to untangle themselves. And we started talking to them, finding out what the problems were, find out how big these collections were, what their requirements were, measured, all these things, lots of measurement. And we sort of permutated all the different combinations of collection and location of the existing locations and a possible new building, hypothetical new building, and you can permutate which goes where. And some of these permutated candidates are non-viable, so you can strike them out straight away. But you end up with quite a number of candidates which are worth considering. Maybe, I think we had about a dozen. But already that's better than just confusion. Having 12 possibilities, you're making good progress. So you're already kind of funneling the cloud of confusion possibilities into maybe a dozen tangible possibilities. But you have to prune those. And what we did was with the client committee, knowledgeable people, but not designers, was to ask them to make a sequence of decisions which would prune this tree of possibilities. And the sequences we told them what sequence they had to make them in, because they didn't have to double back and take a decision early and then find they had to untake it later. And you end up with a single outcome. And everybody said, well, of course, that was obvious. Of course, that's what we're going to do. And having been totally confused at the beginning, it seemed pretty obvious at the end. So that's success. You know, they think, why do we have to employ people to tell us something that's obvious? But on the other hand, it was good in that they were confident that they made the right decision. There wasn't a kind of two parties, you know, fighting over alternatives. And they went ahead, they built the building, it's just about to be opened. And that sequencing of decisions in order to move from confused multiplicity to a single outcome in which people have confidence and proceed and go ahead and carry it out is a kind of funneling effect. And I don't know if that's a useful metaphor. I hadn't heard it called that before, but it's what it is.
Yeah, well, yes, and I thank you, William, for that. I mean, I particularly around the sequencing of decisions. I mean, I think your point about when people see an outcome that's successful or unsuccessful, or somewhere in the middle, people will throw their hands up in horror and say, well, it was obvious all along. I mean, I remember doing research work where you would ask customers about repairs to their properties, in the case of your example, versus the services that they received as social housing residents. And regardless of how good the services were on the social housing residents, in practical terms, there was a flatlining, as we were mentioning earlier on, of customer satisfaction, if you like. Even if you weren't asking people about repairs, it was so impossible to disaggregate those two pieces of information to isolate whether or not you were doing good tenancy services versus good repair services. And once that information is exposed and distilled, then as you say, it becomes. It seems like it was a no-brainer. Obviously, this was the case. But I think that, and part of that paper itself was a sort of play on words called. I think it was called something like the madness in the method, rather than the other way around. And I think the point is that it's understanding that the framework that Claire mentioned as well, that structure and the sequencing that goes, that precedes the seemingly obvious outcome, which may not have been without those steps beforehand. I'm now going to turn to Chris, put him on the spot. Chris, I mean, I'd like to second guess this, but I'll leave this up to you. Which of the adjectives down there do you think resonates most, rings the most bells with you?
Thank you, and it would be remiss of me to not comment on the fact that you're clearly enjoying chairing this, Dr. Ray, given that you've managed to point out that, thanks to our colleagues, Dr. Claire Murray and Dr. William Fawcett, I am indeed the Oompa Loompa of science here, and merely Chris. So thank you for that to begin with. I think for me here, I want to kind of step back up to the whole principle of data to decisions, right? I mean, that is a process in itself, and it merits exploration. And for the purpose of that, I have a visual aid that I'll be using momentarily to help explain how I think this really works. But fundamentally, there's two steps in this. The first is diagnosing those organizational strengths and weaknesses that are preventing an organization being good at data to decisions, or as I would perhaps put it, being information enabled as an organization. And then there's implementing the change that you need to make in order to become information enabled. And I think it's worth distinguishing the two steps. But in terms of what does it look like when you're information enabled, I think what I've got here is a little wheel of data to decisions. Okay, so we can start with data at the top. And then you might argue that the data allows you to identify challenges and opportunities, at least in an ideal world. And then once you've got challenge and opportunities, you can look at options and you can find evidence to evaluate those options. And then all the way around here, we eventually get a decision, hopefully. And once we've made a decision, what we should theoretically do is then evaluate. And of course, the evaluation, especially if it's continuous ongoing, results in more data. Hence this fantastic little circular visual aid. These will be available on Amazon for a small fee shortly. But there's a problem in all of this, which is that while I don't think many people would argue with that being a reasonable cycle for data to decisions in full, the first thing is that it doesn't really matter how you look at this. Data is not next to decisions. So there's other stuff that you need to get right. The other problem with this is that people don't look at it like this, because people live predominantly in one of these roles. So the way people look at it is more like this. It's more like those old Whatno little cartoons with a little face peering over a wall. So I might be the data person and I see this. So I see a lot about data, and I might see, a little bit about the challenges and opportunities the data implies, and a little bit about how the evaluation is giving me the data, but really it's data that I see. And I'm probably, as I'm often actually in reality called, the data nerd. This is me, this is where I sit. And the problem with being the data nerd is that as we kind of go through this cycle, the decisions are all the way around here. And the person who's making the decisions, they don't know about the data nerd because they're not adjacent. It's not within their field of view. And that's a real problem. So, when Claire was talking about alignment, this is, one of the real areas that it gets manifest. If this person making the decision doesn't recognize how they need to relate to the person over here with the data, you've got a problem, because you're not going to have data to decisions. I think the other kind of symptom of that is that what we often see is back over here in our decisions space, who's making those decisions? Well, these are our managers, possibly certainly our leaders, our executives, right? These are the people that will often make a decision based on a whole range of factors that they'll have taken into account. Certainly not just data, certainly not data in the conventional sense. And sometimes, especially if the decision is not seen as perhaps, organizational life-threatening in nature, this decision can be made not exactly on a whim, but as a consequence of the director attending a conference and seeing a shiny thing, for example. I mean, most directors might not admit that that's how they make decisions, but I think we've all worked in organizations where the directors come back from a conference and said, we're doing this. And the problem with that is, where's this process in that decision? The decision's here. I mean, I can almost push it right down to the very bottom here. That's all you've got. You've got a decision. There's nothing else. There's no problem or challenge necessarily that's been identified for it to solve. And there's certainly no options or evaluation of the different choices that might be made. So that's a real problem that we need to figure out. So how do we address that kind of thing? Well, as you can probably hear in the way I'm talking about it, and as Claire pointed out really, and William, it often becomes a question of culture, and especially trust and respect, right? If the person there is not working in a way that respects all of these other people in this cycle, then you've got a problem. And also process, of course, particularly the process of making decisions. If your processes allow a decision to be made without, doing our evaluation of the options or identifying clearly what the problem or opportunity might be, then again, we're flawed. And also, I think the final thing I want to kind of say before turning it back to you, Rob, is that in order to take data and turn the data into decisions, there's a set of skills required for that. So you need to audit those skills associated with each of these roles on this circle and make sure that they're present in your organization. And particularly data skills, right? All the way through this. If we're going to make data into decisions, then we've got to have data skills pervasively through this cycle. And, we used to call those skills statistics, but really now we're talking about big data skills and data science and those kinds of terms. But it boils down to the same kind of things. It's a fluency with data that I would argue quite often is missing from at least some of these roles. And if it's not present, then that's a problem.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I mean, I feel I'm glad that you've taken one for the team by presenting a lower tech version than my 2 lines of a decision funnel. Mine was at least a slide, but I think the point you make about the adjacency, and I have to say, I think I have now got a great idea for if only somebody would come up with a model that that galvanized all of those different components together so that they were adjacent. And I think we should. If you look on DataClan's website, you might find such a model. And what I'd like to do now is just shameless plug. I'd like to just invite Dad, Rolly, either of you, if you had any reflections, things you might want to add. Rolly, shall I start with you? Or do you need? You're never short of an innovative idea. So
I'm just thinking on the past week where all of this has all come to play, especially in conferences or events where things of a very technical nature at times could have been discussed. And the conversation that Chris was just saying around decision makers, and they're being sold shiny new things in some ways, things like IoT, and who in their right mind at a senior level knows the ins and outs of communication protocols and data standards and how that all interacts with APIs into systems, and actually in order to engage all the stakeholders in the conversation and join that circle up. In some ways, I think I agree with what Claire says. You need to speak a different language to be able to simplify. And I don't want to use the word dumb it down because I think that's disingenuous, but we need to make it understandable, because there's a lot of complexity in a lot of the things we do, whether it be building the Sydney Opera House. As a user, I can look at that, but how do I know what the thermal dynamics of the building are operating at? And somebody needs to understand that, especially when we come to decarbonisation. So I think the thing that brought home to me today, this week, was actually it's about, when you're trying to deliver that change, it's about tempering your language to make it easy for other people to understand, to be able to move down through that tunnel. So that's my little.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, I think that I think this week's conferences and so on, I agree. I mean, I think illustrate the challenge better than anything else. And I think that the idea that that any model or approach or decision funnel that you utilize should be predicated itself on the interdependencies of all of these different moving parts. And I think that's something that it seems like a very intuitively obvious thing, but as you've described, it doesn't always translate into actual kind of the actual narrative and or practical application. Dan, have you got anything you would like to share?
Yeah, well, I think one of the strengths of DataClan is the diversity of the people who come together, not just to do work, but to listen to what's going on in these sessions. And at your initial comments, you mentioned the nidus of creativity for DataClan was the COVID pandemic. So I sort of listened to what was being said within that context. And what I heard from William was a very elegant example of the information tunnel, etc., and how you get a large number of decisions funneled into one outcome, which everybody's happy with. But then you listen to Claire, who's from a different background, and she's almost describing a reverse tunnel where you've got a few people who are actually imposing decision-making, etc., on a wider group of people. And the way that you get everybody on board is by psychologically aligning the workforce. And then Chris puts it into a sort of quasi-governmental type model where you say that you have data at one end and people like Neil Ferguson extrapolating on imaginary data and coming up with completely farcical outcomes. And meanwhile, you've got government ministers who are at the decision end of things, who are completely ignoring all of the data. And we end up with a situation where currently we have a government who is simultaneously trying to persuade people who are unvaccinated to become vaccinated because the vaccines work so efficiently. But at the same time, they're trying to persuade the vaccinated people that the vaccine doesn't work and therefore they need to go and get a booster. So the way that works is by getting the population to be aligned by some psychological mechanism where they all go and just do what they're told. You know, it seems to me that, you know, William and Claire and Chris all have a completely different point of view about you know, the concepts that you were talking about initially, but the outcome is within the COVID-19 pandemic, really quite difficult to tease out, because the other thing that, of course, that happens is that, you know, everybody's working on the assumption that you take data and you make informed, information-based decisions on that. But of course, the decisions that the government are making at the moment might be based on a completely different agenda than the data that's being supplied. So it's just looking at it from a completely different perspective.
Thank you, Dad, for that. Okay, and yeah, go back to Sleep America. Your government's in control. Friday's public broadcast on behalf of the Data Clan Party. I would like to. I'm just conscious of time. What I want to do is just kind of just sum up some of the things that have stood out from what my colleagues at Data Clan have said. That I think, and I would start, and I think that without wanting, I think that there is an interaction that's important to call out here, and that interaction is between and as Dad said there, you know, which direction you look at things, whether or not it's the, you know, the tail wagging the dog or the other way around in terms of cultural change and development and decision making. When you look at the psychology of that, if you presuppose that these phenomenon or these biases or these kind of distortions are a risk, which I think, based on what we've all said, and from William's perspective, from a construction point of view, from Claire's perspective, from trust, and what Roly said about, you know, the understanding and you know, same with Chris and the data literacy and all of those risks, and or you know, those in themselves are capabilities which needs to exist within that decision funnel. They need to be applied, and I think that what I would like to, you know, I mean, we've heard about cognitive traps and, you know, the adjacency of data to decisions, the data literacy part, so, you know, the stuff around kind of looking at a briefing and understanding what your prioritization and so on should be. I think I would finish on just with the observation that if we assume that all of these things are risks or opportunities, then there needs to be, and I don't want to use the words checks and balances, but there is a very practical framework which allows you to say, you know, when you see this, what do you do? When this happens, why do you know, to be questioning and challenging things at each point. And I think, just going back to Chris's kind of wheel that he was describing earlier on, I think that the mechanism which has worked best for us in that regard is really having those checks and balances or challenges or interactions coming from all different, and again, it seems intuitive, but it's about putting the structure in place to facilitate that, to allow those conversations to happen, and to allow each of the components on that wheel to kind of move towards the center and towards each other in a way that becomes routine as part of a kind of continuous improvement mindset. So on that note, we're coming up to time. I just wanted to thank my Data Clan colleagues, as always. Look out for the next trailer for our next Clan cast, and I would like just to wish you all a great weekend, and we'll see you again for more Data Clan fun next week. Thank you.